Good morning. Biology 1300, Chapter 12, the processes that lead to evolution. It will always help if you turn the clicker on. Every time a cell divides, there is the opportunity for a mutation to occur. Every time that a cell undergoes mitosis, there is the possibility that some mistake in replication will happen. If those mistakes happen and then they're allowed to remain in that new cell as the cell divides, that is what a mutation is. And every time that happens, it can lead to mutation. The intestinal parasite E. coli, whoops, wrong button, sorry. The intestinal parasite E. coli, everybody's heard of E. coli, divides every 17 minutes. In an ideal world, in a microbiological incubator, that 17 minutes can actually be reduced to less than 10 minutes. So again, that leads to very rapid diversification. If these mutations occur, then they can spread throughout that population in that little petri dish very quickly. If that's happening in nature, in human beings, for instance, as they're separating, it can lead to lots of diversification among the bacteria. Humans, we use antibiotics. The overuse of antibiotics may very well be leading to antibiotic resistance. We now know that there are lots of antibiotics that used to be very effective against bacteria that no longer are. Their effectiveness has been reduced. And part of that problem is the overuse and misuse of antibiotics. If, for instance, you have, say, 1% of a population of a particular bacteria has a mutation that gives it resistance to a particular antibiotic, but it's only 1% of the population, that may not be a problem. But what's going to happen if we start using antibiotics when they're really not necessary? Well, the number of susceptible bacteria will be reduced, but what's going to happen to the number of resistant bacteria? They're going to increase. And over a long enough period of time, what was at one time 1% of the population of all the E. coli may now be 7 or 8% of the population of E. coli. You've all probably heard of antibiotic-resistant strains of tuberculosis, antibiotic-resistant strains of E. coli. There's something called methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, more commonly referred to simply as MRSA. All of these things can be somewhat, I'm not going to say it's the exact cause, but they can be somewhat staged or laid at the feet of our use of antibiotics and giving them a selective pressure, giving that we've used that antibiotic incorrectly. Individuals in a population share the same traits because they share the same genes. Alleles of the same genes are the main source of variation in a population. If there are two distinct forms of alleles, we are referred to as dimorphic. If human eye color, is that a dimorphic trait? Are there only two human eye colors? No, there's lots of human eye colors. So they're not dimorphic. When we were talking about Mendel in the last chapter, and we talked about his pea plants, if you'll remember, those flowers were either purple or white. The seeds were either green or yellow. The pod was either smooth or wrinkled. The seed was smooth or wrinkled. Those are all examples of dimorphic traits. There's only two forms. A polymorphic trait, however, is one that there are several distinct traits. If a flower, for instance, given a certain set of genes, produces blue flowers or red flowers or white flowers or yellow flowers, that would be a polymorphic trait, like eye color in human beings. Traits with continuous variations may have interactions of several genes or be influenced by the environment. There are flowers, for instance, that if they grow above a certain altitude, the flowers are one color. If they grow below a certain altitude, they are another color. There is a bush, golly gee whiz, I can't remember the name of the bush. My grandmother used to grow them and she loved them. And they produce these big sort of pom-poms of little flowers. When these things bloom, the flower cluster is, bigger than a grapefruit. But if you look at it closely, it's made up of all these individual little flowers. And the kind my grandmother planted were either blue or pink. And I don't remember exactly which one was which, but it was based on the amount of iron in the soil. And my grandmother had several of these plants around her yard. And some of them, she would literally drive, everybody knows what a railroad spike is, right? Those great big nails that hold the track down onto the crossties. My grandmother would drive railroad spikes into the soil. So that would increase the iron level. So some of her plants would bloom one color, and then the ones in the other parts of the yard would bloom a different color. That would be an example of an environmental role in the traits. The main source, or one source of new alleles, and actually I was correct in saying the main source of new alleles is mutation. If the gene doesn't exist, the only way to get that gene is for the original gene to mutate. And here are some other sources. Mutation, the original source of any new alleles. Crossing over introduces new combinations of alleles into chromosomes, but note, this is simply new combinations. It's not a new allele. Independent assortment, we talked about that in a previous chapter. Again, this is mixing of the maternal and paternal chromosomes, but again, not new information, just reshuffling the deck. And then fertilization, which combines alleles from two parents. Now, again, variation in traits. Dad has blonde hair, mom has black hair, kids have brown hair. Yeah, it's a combination of things. Kids could also have blonde hair, kids could have black hair. But again, the only source of new alleles is mutation. All the rest of these things that cause variation in traits are simply reshuffling what was there to begin with. Many mutations give rise to either structural, functional, or behavioral alterations that will reduce an individual's chances of surviving and reproducing. Let's say you are an animal that lives in the grasslands of the western United States. The area of the country is almost always from green to brown, lots of sage, lots of other things out there that make the brown colorization. And you're a rabbit that lives in that area, and thanks to your brown color, you blend in with the environment, and it's harder for predators to see you. You have a mutation that gives you a structural difference, makes you turn white. Well, you are now in serious trouble if you are the color of snow in the middle of a big brown field of grass. So that would be an example of a mutation that would limit your chances of survival. Behavioral alterations. You're an animal that's supposed to be out at night, and you have some sort of a mutation that your eyes are now very, you can't see at night, so you have to come out in the daytime. Or you're an animal that needs to be out in the daytime, and now your eyes are incredibly sensitive to light, so you come out at night. That would be a behavioral alteration. The mutation is simply making you change the way you act. Functional. You have a mutation where your gametes don't form properly. All of those can lead to lowered chances of survival. Things like a lethal mutation usually causes death, drastically alters the phenotype. If you think back 3 or 4 chapters when we talked about mutations, we talked about the difference between a point mutation and a frame shift mutation, and that frame shift mutation drastically changed the genotype of the organism. That would be an example of a type of lethal mutation. Neutral mutation doesn't bother you at all. Matter of fact, in most times in these neutral mutations, other than doing a karyotype or a genotypic analysis, there's no way to even tell it's happened. And lastly, the beneficial mutation. This is one that gives you a better chance at survival. Maybe you live in a cold climate and you have a mutation that gives you slightly thicker fur. Makes you contrast the, or in the case of today, the temperature of the planet is slightly going up. You have a mutation that makes your fur a little thinner. Therefore, you're better able to control temperature in the summer when it's getting warmer, and it gives you a benefit over your colleagues who don't have that mutation. The gene pool is all the genes in a population. You've probably heard the word gene pool. There are some jokes out there that when you see somebody, you say, man, that guy must have come from the shallow end of the gene pool. All the genes, so all the genes in human beings, all of the alleles, that would be the gene pool. The abundance of a particular allele among members of a population is the allele frequency. When we talk about allele frequency, maybe we're talking about brown eyes. Well, the frequency of the brown-eyed allele is common. Most human beings have brown. The larger component of eye color, most of them are brown. You can also talk about blood types and blood groups. The most common blood group, the allele that is most common, is the O type. The O blood group is most common among human beings. Now, you may hear at some point that one of the rarest blood types is O negative, and that is true. O negative is known as the universal donor. My wife happens to be O negative, and once the American Red Cross finds out that you are O negative, they will call you every 56 days going, yes, this is Bill at the American Red Cross. Could we count on you for a donation this week? Because they need that universal blood group, which is the universal donor, the O negative. But most people who are blood group O are O positive. And there are, when you take the O positive and O negative, most human beings, the largest percentage of human beings of all the four blood groups, O group is the largest. Microevolution is small-scale change in allele frequencies of a population. This always occurs in natural population, and it is caused by mutations, natural selection, and genetic drift. And we'll talk about each one of those things here in a little bit. Whether, the mutation, we talked about natural selection. That's what Darwin proposed. Nature selects those things. And then genetic drift. I'm sure we'll talk about genetic drift in a little more detail here in a few moments. Natural selection influences allele frequency in a population by operating on phenotypes with a heritable genetic base. Deer. Some male deer have large antlers, some male deer have smaller antlers, and those are controlled by genes, and natural selection says that the males with the bigger antlers are going to be more impressive to the females. They're more likely to reproduce, passing on those genes. And ultimately, that will be the direction that things go. Natural selection can occur in patterns, however. There are three different types of selection within natural selection. Directional selection means that, if you'll remember a couple of chapters ago, we had that bell curve where I think they said they were band members or something, were standing on the bleachers, and they had formed that bell curve. There was the 5'7" person, and then the 2 5'8" people, and the 3 5'9". That and it had that bell curve. All right. What happens in directional selection is those people, for whatever reason, or if maybe we're talking about flower height, whatever, they're not reproducing randomly. The taller people are reproducing, but the shorter people are not. And what will happen over time is we're going to maintain our bell curve, but it's going to start moving. You know, 1 year, this is the average height, and 10 years later, the average height has moved slightly taller, or it could also go slightly smaller. That would be an example of directional selection. Nature's doing the selecting, but it's moving one direction or the other. Stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection occurs when, again, the people on the fringes aren't doing a good job getting their genes into the next generation. So the few really tall ones and the few really short ones are not, but the ones that fall right in the middle are. And what happens to your bell curve is it starts to narrow. Instead of being wide at the base, it gets narrow at the base, and there are many more people in that middle group, that middle 3 or 4 heights, which is the one, you know, we had in our demonstration or our illustration. That one would be an example of that. That's where we look, and it's coming together. It's narrowing the bell curve. That would be stabilizing selection. And lastly, disruptive selection. What happens there is the people on each extreme are doing good jobs getting their genes into the next generations, but the ones in the middle aren't. So now instead of having this nice bell curve that looks like this, we have this little thing that looks like this. You're increasing your numbers on the smaller end, you're increasing your number on the upper end. The average is still the same. It's just there's a whole lot fewer people, or a whole lot fewer flowers, or whatever you're measuring, a whole lot fewer of them in the middle. That is disruptive selection. The mode of natural, again, this is talking about directional selection. The example of this is the peppered moths, the rock pocket mice, and antibiotic resistant bacteria. You're moving to one side. With the peppered moths, that's the classic one that we showed, or they talk about in every biology book I've ever seen. They were talking about moths in England when the Industrial Revolution hit. The trees were covered with a gray, light-colored lichen, which is a sort of a mossy type growth. And most of the moths were that color. So when the moth was sitting on the side of the tree, it wasn't very visible to birds. There was also a darker phase of the moth, but there weren't a whole lot of them, because most of them, when they came out of their cocoons and they started flying around and they landed on the side of the tree, a bird would say, "Ooh, lunch," and grab it and eat it. But as the Industrial Revolution came and we started burning coal, and the coal dust covered the trunks of the trees, all the lichen died, and the side of the tree went from being sort of a palish gray color to a more dark, almost black color. Now the white flies are showing up very well and getting eaten. And what happened over time is you had mostly whites and a few blacks and grays. But then what happened over time is that it started to move toward the darker phase of that organism. And again, here's the pictures of the peppered moth. There's the moth right there, sitting on the tree covered with lichen. There's the black phase moth. And again, when we talked about evolution in the last chapter, and I talked about people were upset that these were actually created, yes, these were actually researchers who took a dead moth and stuck it on the side of a tree to take a picture of it. And they took a dead black moth and put it on the side of a tree to take a picture of it. And then they talked about the darker trees after the Industrial Revolution. There's the dark colored moth right there. You can just barely see the doggone thing. The light one really stands out. Stabilizing selection maintains that intermediate body size. The sociable weaver bird is an example. Here's our sociable weavers. These are birds that make nests by weaving little sticks in and amongst each other. Why they're called weavers. They instead of just stacking stuff, they actually weave a nest. Whoops. And what happens to them over time is with body mass, again, doesn't give me a, it does. This is in grams. So it's 2.85 to 2.95. That's most of the birds fall in that category. Yeah, there's still some smaller ones and there's some bigger ones, but most of them fall right here. And as time goes on, the birds begin to get more and more of the birds will take on that body size. And then disruptive selection, dimorphism in seed cracker bills is maintained by environmental factors that affect feeding performances. Again, this is the one where you're going to wind up with a shape that looks like that, sort of like the McDonald's arches. These are African seed crackers. These are birds that take seeds and they eat seeds and they crack them open to eat them. You can see this bird has a fairly substantial beak, 12 millimeters wide, but this bird, a much larger beak. So this bird is going to go after small seeds. This bird is going to go after large seeds. And you're going to have these two extremes. Not a lot of birds in the middle, not a lot of birds with a 13 or 14 millimeter wide bill, probably because that size bill not big enough to crack open the larger seeds, but maybe a little bit too big to manipulate the smaller seeds. Yeah, it could easily break those small seeds, but because of this lower bill being a little bit bigger, he can't manipulate them as well and can't keep them in between the parts of his bill to break them apart. Another way natural selection occurs is by sexual selection. This is where some individuals of a population out-reproduce others because they're better at securing mates. Folks, sexual selection in virtually all animals is a female choice. Now, guys, you may think that when you go to the club and you're, again, ladies, please do not be offended by this. I do not mean any offense. But guys, when you're in the club scoping out the honeys, you may think you're the one in control, but you're not. You're not in control. It's the women who are controlling this. In nature, it's the women who make the two buck deers fight each other. In nature, it's the women that make those two bull elephant seals beat one another half to death on the beach. It's women controlling sexual selection. The most adaptive forms of a trait are those that help individuals defeat rivals for mates or are most attracted to the opposite sex. Think about birds. Just Google some pictures of birds. Again, don't have Google stock. You can use any search engine you want. But just Google pictures of birds. And then Google pictures of male birds and female birds of the same species. The male birds are always going to be prettier. Human beings are the only organism on the planet where the female is the one that makes herself up to be attractive to the males. All the rest of nature, it's the males. You know, if you look at those, there's these birds called the birds of paradise, and they have these gigantically long tails and these tremendously long feathers on the end of their wings. These birds can barely fly because of all these excess feathers. But the ones with the biggest, showiest feathers get the girl. The peacock, it's a male. The female of that species is called a peahen. The peacock, we all know what a peacock looks like. A peahen is a little gray lady. Doesn't have the big showy feathers. Doesn't have all of those things. The cardinal, the really bright red. When you see a really bright red cardinal sitting on a bush in your backyard, that's a male. The female is sort of a drab gray color. So again, sexual selection. Sexual dimorphism is one outcome. Sexual dimorphism means that the opposite sex has a dimorphic shade. In other words, the male may be significantly larger than the female. In some cases, it's actually the opposite. Most spiders, if you see a great big spider running around, that's more than likely a female. Most male spiders are little bitty things. And most male spiders get to mate once in their life, and then just about the time they finish doing what they need to do to make the babies, the female spider reaches up on her back, throws the male spider down, and eats him. Again, sexual selection. Here's some of those birds of paradise. You see all these feathers on the back. He's engaged in a courtship display. He's caught the eye. Here's the female. Here's the male. Here's two bull elephant seals in combat. You'll notice all this area right here on both of these. That's where their skin has been torn. They have some pretty significant teeth up here that you can't really see very well because of the bulbous nose that they have. But they do have some pretty substantial teeth. And what they do is they rear up and slam into each other, and they cut and rip. This is very thick blubber on these animals. These fights usually don't result in death. Usually, eventually, one of these males will say, okay, I've had enough. You can have this stretch of beach. I'm going to go down that way a little bit. Again, these birds of paradise, this guy will throw out his wings and throw up his tail, and he'll dance and do all sorts of courtship displays, sometimes for hours, trying to get her attention. And then these are stalk-eyed flies. You see, here's the eye on the end of the stalk. The females prefer the eyes with the longest eye stalks. However, the long eye stalk don't give there's no survival advantage to it. It's just, for whatever reason, it's what the female wants. And so the female wants this male who has those really, really long eyes. That is sexual selection. Again, that's the eye right there. This is just the stalk that holds the eye, has the optic nerve running down through to the very minuscule brain that those organisms have. Balancing polymorphisms. How do we maintain multiple alleles? Non-identical alleles for a trait are maintained in a population provided there is random mating. In other words, if I am just as likely to reproduce as the guy standing next to me and the guy standing next to him, and we're all intermingling, we will have balancing that polymorphism. This occurs when environmental conditions favor heterozygotes over homozygotes. The example that your text uses is the HBS mutation of the beta globulin chain, which causes sickle cell anemia in the homozygote. This is the really interesting thing we have discovered about the sickle cell. Now, everybody has heard of people who have normal red blood cells, people who carry the sickle cell trait, and then people who have sickle cell anemia. Now, here's the thing. Do I have a marker in here? Hang on just a second. Let me see if I've got a marker. And of course, there's not a marker in here, so I'll do the best I can without a marker. But the heterozygote for this condition is you have one gene for good red blood cells, and you have one gene for the sickle cell red blood cell. Now, here's what we have discovered over the last 50 years in areas of the world where sickle cell comes from. Now, sickle cell originally was found in equatorial Africa, in the central parts of Africa. When I was going to school in elementary school and junior high, we were even told that only people of African descent got, only the African American population could get sickle cell. Well, we now know that there are lots of cases of people, again, please don't infer anything from this, but people who would be considered Caucasian can have sickle cell because of the mingling of different ethnicities that has gone on over the last 150, 200, 300 years. But originally, again, in the 1970s, we were told only black people got sickle cell. Well, we know that's not right now. That's the difference between me in my teens and me almost 60. So, and yes, I know you look at me and you go, oh my God, Mr. Russell, you cannot possibly be nearly 60 years old. Well, yes, I can. But you know what they say, 60 is the new 40. But what we have discovered is people who have two good genes in those areas get bitten by mosquitoes, they develop malaria and die. People who have two bad genes get sickle cell anemia and die. But people who are the heterozygote, they carry one good gene, one bad gene, they don't get sickle cell, they also don't get malaria. They have a resistance to malaria. So that's why the population in these areas of the heterozygote is much higher than anticipated. Theoretically, the heterozygote should be about 50% of the population. 20% of the population should be homozygote dominant, 25% should be homozygote recessive. But what we have discovered with this one, and there are other ones as well, is that what should be a 50% population is actually more like 70 to 75% population, because this genotype gives you an advantage. Genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies in a population over time due to chance alone. The number of genes for a particular thing move, and they're doing that over time due to chance. This effect is greatest on small populations. We are concerned as biologists about elephants, African elephants. We are concerned about cheetahs. We are concerned about lots of, especially African large mammals, because human beings have been stupid and have been bad stewards of the planet, and we have killed them to the point where their populations are very small. And when their populations get to be small, genetic drift can occur. One of the genetic drifts that has occurred in the cheetah in Africa is, everybody knows that the cheetah is the fastest land mammal on the planet. It can run 70 miles an hour. And historically, not only could the cheetah run 70 miles an hour, but it can only do that for a short distance, a few hundred yards. It can't run 70 miles an hour from here to Fayetteville and back. But from here to, the other side, I'm on South Campus, the other side of the Cami building, 300 or 400 yards, it can run 70 miles an hour. And historically, they could do that 5 or 6 or 7 times a day, because contrary to popular belief, predators aren't usually really effective or efficient about the way they capture their prey. Usually, they miss a lot. And when they miss a lot, they have to try a bunch of times. Well, historically, what the cheetah could do was it could chase an antelope and miss, rest for a few minutes and chase an antelope and miss, and wait for a few minutes and chase an antelope and miss, and wait for a few minutes and chase it, and then eventually it would catch one. It would be successful almost every day. So the cheetah could eat every day. And the mother cheetah with her 3 cubs could eat every day so she could feed her cubs every day. Then human beings got involved. Human beings decided 2 things about the cheetah. Number one, the cheetah's coat looked better on us than it did on them, so we killed a whole ton of them to make coats and jackets and gloves and hats and scarves and all that kind of crap. And the second thing we decided was they'd make really, really good pets. You can Google images of the 1970s, especially in England, and you couldn't hardly throw a stick down the street in London at the time without hitting somebody walking an exotic animal like a tiger or a cheetah or a puma on a leash. It was ridiculous. But what has happened with the cheetah is over time, and we've made that population so small, and the genetic drift has happened to such that the cheetah can still run 70 miles an hour. But the cheetah population in Africa now has lost the endurance genes. They can run that 70 miles an hour, but instead of being able to do it 7 or 8 times a day, they can only do it once or twice a day. And if they're only going to be successful in catching prey 1 out of every 8 times, and they can only do this 3 times a day, that means they're only going to be able to catch something to eat every 3rd day on average. And if mama cheetahs are only doing that every 3rd day, they don't have the resources to feed 3 babies. So she has to determine, okay, which one of these babies is most likely to survive, and then she runs the other 2 off. So it's affecting the population because the population's gotten small, and now the population can't rebuild because of genetic drift. Genetic drift is pronounced in small or inbreeding populations, such as those that occur after an evolutionary bottleneck. A bottleneck is where up here you have a whole bunch of organisms, you kill all of them, eliminate a bunch of the genes, and then when the population is allowed to rebound, all of those genes that were lost are gone forever. Just like the population or the endurance genes in the cheetah. Those endurance genes are gone. They're never coming back. And so even if we manipulate the population of cheetahs and we get them back to where there's tens or hundreds of thousands of cheetahs running around the African plains, it's still going to be 70 miles an hour 2 or 3 times a day because those genes for endurance are gone. Reduction in population size is often so severe that it reduces genetic diversity. This can lead to what is called the founder effect, where a change in allele frequencies that occur after a small population of individuals establish a population. These founding populations are often necessarily inbred, and we know some of the results of inbreeding. The founder effect would happen if the organism that came out of the bottleneck was much, much different than the organism that went into the bottleneck. You might actually be founding an entirely new species. Founder effect in the old order Amish people. If you can look at this little child very closely, right there, that's an extra finger. It's called polydactyly. Also, we're looking at a group here, polydactyly and dwarfism, and you can also look at this baby and see that, the legs, the relationship of the body to the head is not quite right that you would see for a baby that age. The original population looked like this. Lots of, and I don't like the word normal, but lots of normal genes. Population was greatly reduced, leaving only this group of genes. Now, when the new population rebounded, you only had this. See, the blue genes are gone forever. And again, this allele causes Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome, which occurs in a very high frequency in the gene pool of the Lancaster Amish. The Lancaster Amish are a group of Amish folks that live in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area. Outward indications of the disorder are polydactyly and dwarfism, which both appear on this little Amish baby. Gene flow is the physical movement of alleles between populations as individuals immigrate or emigrate. Immigrate moves in, emigrate with an E, move out. We are concerned in the United States right now with an immigration issue. We're not overly concerned about immigration. Most folks want to come to America for a better life. There aren't hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people every year wanting to leave the United States to go somewhere else. Now that may change, who knows what's going to happen over the next 20 or 25 years, but for the last 150 years, people have been clamoring to get into the United States. They want to immigrate. They want to emigrate from where they were. They were living in Ireland. Ireland had a potato famine. All the Irish wanted to come running over here. In the late 1800s, there were signs literally all over the East Coast when people would need jobs and they would go, help wanted, Irish, need not apply. So that was what was going on when the Irish were moving in. And again, I am of Scotch-Irish descent. My people did not come over to this country until much later than that. I can only trace my lineage in the United States back about 100 to 125 years. All of my ancestors came to this country post-Civil War. In the 1880s is when most of them came. Jays transfer acorns and their alleles among oak trees that otherwise would be genetically isolated. Jays, we're talking about blue jays, birds that carry. They'll pick up an acorn and they're going to fly it back to their nest. And while they're flying back, they try to reposition it. either in their claws or in their mouth, and they drop it, well, they're not going to go down and try to find that same one again. They're just going to try to go find another one. And if they've flown from an area where there were a lot of oak trees over into an area where there were no oak trees, now there's an oak tree. That's gene flow. Those genes are flowing into a new place. Speciation is the process by which new species arise from existing species. This is one of those things that can be really, really difficult to get a grasp on, the process of speciation. How does it occur? We know it occurs. That's one of the things that a lot of the folks who are anti-evolution will say, well, this is something you can't see. You can't see it. Well, yeah, well, sure we can. We've seen it. We have seen speciation. Now, we've never seen the type of massive speciation that would have to have occurred for a proto-human being to evolve into a modern human. But we have seen things, speciation in plant species especially. Reproductive isolation, the absence of gene flow between populations due to a lack of interbreeding. Now, make sure you see, not interbreeding, not inbreeding, different things. This divergence can lead to speciation. There is a flower out in Colorado that used to grow in a valley and along the slopes of a certain mountain out near the campus of Western Colorado University. I did some work with this in my graduate school. And these flowers actually had 3 color variants. There was a blue and there was a white, and I cannot remember what the 3rd color variant was. But these flowers grew all over this mountain valley and up the slopes of this mountain. Historically, people had been studying these flowers and been looking at these flowers and talking about these flowers for, decades. And in the 1940s, right after World War II, a developer bought the property. And what he wanted to do was develop a ski resort. I mean, he had 2 mountain slopes and he had a valley. He was going, man, I could make a gajillion dollars out here. So he developed the valley. He sort of left the slopes alone so they could get covered up with snow in the fall, in the winter, so people could ski on them. But he had his down in the valley. That's where he had, the lodge and the Starbucks. There wasn't no Starbucks at that time, but all of those things. And these particular slopes, one of them was westward facing. In other words, it got afternoon sun. The other one was eastward facing. It got morning sun. And what happened over about 25 or 30 years is blue flowers started growing over here. White flowers started growing over here. And that intermediate color, these are very dark, and it just clicked. It was a dark blue, white, and a light blue. And over 25 or 30 years, the light blue flowers disappeared. The people out at Western Colorado University started noticing. It had a different name then. It wasn't Western Colorado University. It was, Colorado Tech or something. But the botany people started noticing that light blue flower was disappearing. And they had known for years that you could take the way you got the light blue flower was taking the pollen of the blue and putting it on the pistil of the white, or taking the pollen of the white and putting it on the pistil of the blue. You had to cross-pollinate them to get the light blue flower. However, now what happens out there, and this is still an area, it's still being studied, it's still a somewhat small ski resort, but all of these blue flowers, the dark blue flowers over here and the light blue flowers over here that used to cross-pollinate, if you pick them up and take them into the lab now, they will no longer cross-pollinate. They have speciated. They are now 2 different species. In 30 years, that occurred. If that could happen in that plant in 30 years, what could happen in some other organisms over 30,000 years. Speciation. Reproductive isolation. Again, the blue flowers got over here and they were isolated from the white flowers. The white flowers were isolated from the blue because of the construction that went on in the valley. And they changed. Again, how do we prevent interbreeding? Different species. These are called reproductive isolating mechanisms. And there are 7 of them. Reproduction occurs at different times in the different species. There's 2 groups, there's 2 animals. Let's say, I don't know, just 2 animals. One of them, and unlike humans, most animals' reproductive cycle is once, maybe twice a year, but most of them, deer for instance, is once a year. Well, let's say, for instance, you've got one group of deer who the females are ready to reproduce in October, and the males are ready in October, but another group is ready in January. Well, the October males are no longer ready. They've gone out of rut. That's what it's called. And so they're at different times for different species. Another way that reproduction can be isolated, species live in different places, so they can't meet. You know, one of them lives in Colorado, or one of them lives in the United States, the other one lives in Europe. They can't get together, so they're isolated. Cues required for sex differ between species. What one organism recognizes as a sexual advance, another organism doesn't. So the male's doing his courtship dance, but the females go, what the heck is wrong with him? They don't recognize the sexual cues. Physical incompatibilities prevent sex between individuals of the different species. I don't care how much love there is between a pygmy goat and a giraffe. Physical incompatibility is going to prevent them from reproducing. Even if their chromosomes were alignable, which they are not, their physical differences, their incompatibilities would prevent it. Those all prevent different species from mating. Well, what happens if mating actually does occur? What if the sheep and the goat, different species, approximately the same size, and maybe some amorous goat just goes berserk and tries to make babies with a sheep? There will be no fertilization. Fertilization won't occur. The chromosomes, the eggs and the sperms are incompatible. So that is a reproductive isolating mechanism. Hybrid individuals or their offspring have reduced fitness. You are 2 different species, you do get together, you do make a baby, but that baby, if it is born, usually doesn't live very long. And finally, you have hybrid animals like the mule that do live a long, nice, and healthy life, but they can't produce offspring. They are infertile. So all of those reproductive isolating mechanisms. Allopatric speciation. Whenever you see the word allopatric speciation, remember physical barrier. Something physical. These are all interactions between things. This is a physical barrier that arises to separate members of a population. The Great Wall of China. Before the Great Wall of China, the organisms over here and the organisms over here were free to go back and forth and intermingle. Put up the Great Wall of China, they can't do that anymore. The Isthmus of Panama, that is where we built the Panama Canal. Organisms could freely go back and forth. Then when we dug a big ditch that they can't cross anymore. That would be the example of a physical barrier. And if some plants or animals at the Great Wall of China have now speciated, and the ones on this side look exactly like the ones on this side, but you put them together and they can't make babies anymore. Allopatric speciation, a physical barrier. Again, there's the Isthmus of Panama showing, what is it? Tell me what these are. Shrimp. You see the two little shrimp, one of them on one side of the Isthmus of Panama, one of them on the other. This is one of those cases where the Isthmus of Panama, you see it here, maybe 50,000 years ago, the ocean was a little bit higher, and there was ocean right there where these shrimp were free to go back and forth. And then the ocean levels go down, this strip of land shows up, and now this population is isolated from this population. Sympatric speciation is a type of speciation that occurs in the same place at the same time, but it can occur in a single generation if chromosome numbers multiply spontaneously. Populations in the same geographic area speciate in the absence of a physical barrier, sympatric speciation. Again, mutations in genes that affect color perception, affect the female cichlid. Cichlid is a type of fish, choice of mates. So here, you see these are multiple color patterns of the same fish, and maybe the females in a particular part of the lake prefer this color. This Lake Victoria is a pretty large lake. It's a pretty deep lake. So maybe the females on one end like this color, the female on the other end like this color, the females in the middle at the really deep depths like this one, and the ones in the middle at the really high depths like this, or excuse me, shallow like this one. And ultimately what you wind up is 4 species of fish found in 4 regions of the lake, where they're perfectly free to swim between those regions of the lake. They just simply choose not to. Macroevolution are large-scale patterns that occur above the species level. You have a lineage that persists for millions of years with little or no change. The coelacanth. Anytime we talk about speciation, we talk about the coelacanth. The coelacanth is a fish that was thought to be extinct for millions of years. We thought they went away something like 30 million years ago. And then in 1938, one was caught off the coast of Madagascar, and we now know that the coelacanth is still alive and well, living in the great depths of the ocean. That lineage will use structure for different purpose than its ancestor did. Feathers and dinosaurs, and yes, we are discovering more and more and more every day that there were several species of dinosaurs that were covered with feathers. We're not real sure what these dinosaurs used the feathers for, whether they were, birds today will use feathers not only for flying, but they also use them for heat control and some other things. We're not sure why the dinosaurs had feathers, but we know we had them. We know why birds use feathers. Again, there's the coelacanth. There's the fossil of the coelacanth that we thought that was extinct, and then there is an example of a live coelacanth. These fish have a very long gestation period. The eggs actually grow and fertilize inside the female, and she gives birth to live offspring. They're referred to as pups, very similar to the way sharks do it. The rostral organ, which is a sensory organ in the front, the rostrum kind of means nose. They have lobed fins. Unlike other fish, most fish fins, we call them ray-finned fishes, and most of them, the fins are actually just extensions of the skin. They're kind of like our nails. But these lobed fin fishes, and this is not the only lobed fin fish, there are several of them. But if you'll notice, their fins actually have a skeletal structure. See how each one of these fins has a bony structure attaching it to the body? Those are lobed fins. Thought that possibly the theory is that these organisms actually is what give rise to legs and arms. An extinct species no longer has any living members. Fossil records point to more than 20 mass extinctions. A mass extinction is the simultaneous lossage of many lineages. And again, historically, these have usually been the result of some sort of asteroid or meteor strike that, killed all the plants and killed all the animals, leaving just a very few, not all, killed most of the animals, most of the plants, and then the world had to regrow and rebuild its numbers. There have been 5 catastrophic events in which the majority of species on Earth disappeared. Once that happens, a phenomenon known as adaptive radiation will begin. If you think about the spokes on a wheel, the hub, that's everything that's left after one of these mass extinction events. And then as those few leftovers start to adapt to the environment that was left behind, they start to radiate out like the spokes from a wheel. Some of them go into this niche, some go into this one, some go into this one. That is adaptive radiation. They're radiating out from a central point, and they are adapting to the environment. The example is the Hawaiian honeycreepers, the different regions of a new environment. A honeycreeper is a bird. The key innovation will be some evolutionary trait that allows its bearer to exploit a habitat more efficiently or in a novel way. Again, maybe when it's left over and you've got this little small group of animals, the only plant life that's left is one that only a very few of them can eat. So they go in to start eating that plant. Well, what are those other ones going to do? Well, maybe they're going to start eating each other, or they're going to start eating the one that's eating the one plant that's left available. So some key innovation. Whoops. There are the honeycreepers. And what you want to look at for these, not necessarily color patterns, because yes, color patterns vary, but look at the beak structure. Look at the beaks. Look at that beak, look at that beak, look at that beak. So again, if you know what you're looking for, you can look at beak structures and see, it's probably a seed cracker. That's probably a seed cracker. That bird right there probably eats the nectar in flowers. It's got that long beak and a long tongue. Let's see, do we have that right there? Is more than likely some kind of a woodpecker. Notice the nice chisel-looking beak. So it's probably a woodpecker. Coevolution is when joint evolution of 2 closely interacting species occurs. Each species is selective and shifts the range of variation. Host and parasites, pollinator and flowers, predator and prey. Co-evolved species, this particular butterfly emerges from a pupa to mate and lay eggs on wild thyme flowers. The larvae emerges and will survive only if a colony of a certain ant adopts them and raises them. So the coevolution is between the butterfly and the ants. Down here is another, okay, this is the ant, and there's the pupae of the butterfly. The ant will then take the butterfly into its colony and will feed on ant larvae for the next 10 months until it becomes a pupae. Biologists have no doubt that macroevolution occurs, but disagree about the mechanism. It may result from many microevolutionary events or an entirely different process. What we do see, and we don't have a good idea of what happens, is dramatic jumps in forms. But it is believed that those happen because of mutations in regulatory genes, which allow for things to grow in organisms that either shouldn't grow or prevents things from growing that should. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species or group. Evolutionary biologists determine common ancestry by identifying what are called derived traits. These derived traits are present in a group under consideration, but not in the group's ancestors. Again, you look at, feathers. These organisms have feathers, but ancestral reptiles, birds have feathers, ancestral reptiles do not. So when we're talking about the phylogeny of birds, we will be looking at feathers. A clade is a group of members that share one or more defining characteristics. Each species is a clade. You could have a clade that is all, I don't know, predators, or all herbivores, or all omnivores. The study of clades and the mapping of clades is called cladistics, and the plotting of those clades into a sort of map of organisms is called a cladogram. I suspect in the next chapter, maybe we will look at a cladogram. If not, I will pull some and put them on Blackboard so you can see what a cladogram actually looks like. But a cladogram is an evolutionary tree, summarizes the hypotheses about the relationships between clades. What is it about this clade on the cladogram that makes it different from this clade? If you have any questions, please contact me, trussell@uaptc.edu, or you may always contact me at the Contact tab Course Messenger link in Blackboard. It's Friday where I am. Everybody have a great weekend. See you next week.